Political upheaval in Armenia. After weeks of unrest, the parliament debates new leadership. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Nikol Pashinyan. Well, he led protests and called for a revolution. The cap-wearing opposition leader, Nikol Pashinyan, has been the face of unrest in Armenia. Last month, when former President Sargsyan went back on his word and returned to power, Pashinyan hit back, launching a campaign to stop him. Thousands took to the streets, and against all odds, Sargsyan was forced to step down. Now, the country faces political upheaval unrivaled in recent years. For more, here's Yolo Abdavith from Yerevan.
There's been no shooting, just shouting. No bombs exploding, just the constant blare of car horns. And only two minor confrontations between protesters and the police. Mostly anti-government demonstrations have been peaceful and calm.
It is a revolution in all senses of the word, both politically but also culturally and epoch-wise. I think it is a true revolution.
Each political rally in the past few weeks started an enthusiastic stampede to attend. Armenians driving for hours to listen to a former journalist and member of parliament who's expected to become prime minister. Nikol Pashinyan has given voice to popular opposition to the ruling Republican Party, which controlled Armenia for almost 20 years.
This is a nationwide revolution, and it's a non-violent velvet revolution which has the sympathy and support of more than 90% of Armenia's population.
Regular Armenians tired of corruption, nepotism and a weak and failing economy want to see real changes. People hang on to every Pashinyan promise of a brighter future in a belief he can improve people's lives.
This is a movement of the youth. The young people want to change their life. They grew up, they see what is happening in Europe, what is happening in Armenia. And they come back, they want to change a lot of things here. This is not a movement of one person. This is not a movement of Nikol Pashinyan.
Yerevan is the center of dissent. More than a third of Armenia's 3 million people live here, and it's where members of parliament chose a new prime minister after Sargsyan resigned on April the 23rd.
A temporary prime minister was named to replace Sargsyan. Karen Karapetyan was an oil executive at one time for Russia's state-owned oil and gas company, Gazprom. He's not a well-known politician, and probably under pressure after watching tens of thousands of demonstrators taking to the streets. His ruling Republican Party here in Parliament and other factions have decided not to put up their own candidate to be Armenia's next leader.
During the past month, there's no doubting Pashinyan's popularity. But other politicians in Armenia fear he represents another form of extremism, especially after he said unless he's made prime minister, the country wouldn't have a leader.
There is always a small risk in this revolutionary situation, of course. But what we have seen the protest of the people. Not Nikol Pashinyan was blocking the street. Not Nikol Pashinyan was blocking the squares. Not Nikol Pashinyan was risking its safety with crashing with police officers. But common Armenian people, men, women, youngsters mostly.
What about Russia? How much of a wild card is Russia and watching? Because it does have, obviously, a vested interest in what happens in Armenia.
Russian people, those who are in charge in Russia, they know that Armenia and the Russia people and state are connected militarily, economically, politically, culturally up till now. So this uprising is an internal thing. It's not a geopolitical issue.
The mass killings of Armenians 100 years ago and the Soviet legacy have left indelible marks on this country's history. Campaigners hope for more prosperity in Armenia and better international relations with neighboring countries.
I think that this is the beginning of the end of transition. Let's say from the post-Soviet context, a new Armenia is trying to emerge out of this. And I think that this example can be very inspiring for other post-Soviet countries as well. And I hope that this peaceful transition to a democracy will be inspiring for other countries, and it can be also a game changer for the region.
Whoever leads Armenia during the next few years will have to manage people's expectations. Elections are expected soon. Pashinyan has awakened an appetite for change to end corruption and poverty. Yolo David, The Newsmakers, Yerevan.
Well, to discuss this further, I'm joined from Yerevan by Richard Garagosian. He is the founding director of the Regional Studies Center, an independent think tank based in Armenia's capital. From Washington, D.C., Philip Gamagalyan. He is a lecturer in the Justice and Peace program at Georgetown University. And completing our panel from Montreal, Canada, is journalist Levon Sevuns. He's been following Pashinyan's progress for the past decade now. Thanks all so much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Richard Garagosian, I have to start with you because you said very clearly the last time we spoke that these protests wouldn't really amount to much and nothing would really change in Armenia. And within about 48 hours, Sargsyan actually resigned. How did you and our other panelists at the time, to be fair, get it so wrong?
Well, in many ways, it was both sudden and an abrupt resignation by the former president turned prime minister. That was also the tipping point. What we see today, however, is that was perhaps the easy part. Now we are in a much more challenging period of systemic change, bringing to bear pressure on the ruling Republican Party, which, like the former president, has been in power for too long, over a decade. And this is where the political arithmetic, the calculus of political change, really comes in. But you're right, many of us were caught off guard, and we underestimated the momentum and the demand for change in Armenia.
Levon Sevuns, did you see the same thing coming? Were you expecting this dramatic change, or did you feel that these protests really couldn't move much in what a political system that was so entrenched in Armenia?
I would have to admit I was quite surprised by how quickly and the protests gathered momentum. I mean, he started, Nikol Pashinyan started his walk, his now famous walk, as a single person. By the time he got to Montreal, to Yerevan, after visiting several cities, he had gathered a huge crowd around himself and had managed to galvanize public opinion and tap into something that a lot of us didn't see existed there.
Okay, Philip, let me ask you, I mean, is Armenia really as unpredictable as it seems from the outside?
Yeah, I was an early supporter of the movement. I believed that they can mobilize people. I did not believe, to be fair, that they'll succeed so quickly. I thought it will take another round and maybe it will last until the next elections. But I believed in the popular mobilization behind this young and progressive movement that was registering progress a few years now. This wasn't really the first mobilization. It was the first one so clearly led by Pashinyan. But there were a few mobilizations on social causes led by young people. And this movement also was led heavily by young people, and Pashinyan turned out to be the leader. But he wasn't the only leader, especially in the early days. He was the one who walked alone from one side of the Armenia to the other. At the same time, there were other groups mobilizing in Yerevan that joined forces with Pashinyan as he arrived to Yerevan. So I was expecting a big mobilization. I wasn't expecting a quick resignation by Sargsyan.
Okay.
I think it was very predictable that this regime cannot last too long.
Levon, it is a young and progressive movement. It's also very untested. We know Armenians want change, but they really are, in a sense, entering the unknown here. Do you think the country is ready for this?
Absolutely. I think you have to give credit to these young people. This is the generation that has grown up after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So this is basically a generation that has grown up in independent Armenia, that doesn't have the same complexes, the same difficulties their parents had experienced. It's a much freer generation, despite Armenia being, semi-authoritarian country in the past decade. It is a country that has quite a vibrant media scene. It's a country that has a very vibrant cultural scene. So there is a lot of internal resource for this kind of liberal movement that, you know, attracted the youth. I mean, this is a generation of Twitter and Instagram. They see what's going on in other countries. They have mastered these communications tools, and they're ready to mobilize. And I see a lot of parallels to what happened in 1998 when the Karabakh movement was, you know, began and was driven mostly again by the young people of my generation.
Okay. Richard Garagosian, I mean, let me ask you your perspective on this. As we said, it's a young and progressive movement, but it's not been tested before. Do you think it's good for Armenia to go forward with something they really haven't tried, or should this youth be really careful what they wish for here?
No, I think the period of caution or careful consideration has passed. This is an accumulation of vibrant discontent. But this is a wave of activism, very much in a positive way. More importantly, this was a rare example of a victory by non-violent, peaceful demonstrators against a rather corrupt, entrenched elite. Therefore, the momentum remains on the side of the youth. More importantly, what we see is, like Armenia at the independence during the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was no preparation then either. In fact, Armenia started 2 steps behind everyone else. And was at war over Nagorno-Karabakh. In this context, it is overwhelmingly positive. And just the fact that we're making news in Montreal and Washington is significant.
Richard, I mean, I love your upbeat tone now, but we spoke earlier when we debated this prior to the resignation of Serge Sarkisyan that there was a genuine lack of political alternatives, and that's why you and our other panelists thought that nothing was going to change. Why is this suddenly safe territory to enter? Why is there so much confidence now that there will be good enough people to take the lead in a new government?
For 2 reasons in particular. First is the ruling elite. The Republican Party and its leadership is now so deeply discredited that there is a new, fresh opportunity for more of a consensus coalition, much more technocratic and much more professional. In fact, all day in Armenia today, there was an example of a parliament for the first time ever fulfilling the role of a parliament in a positive way with a policy debate, in a negative way, a partisan posturing, challenging the opposition leader, Pashinyan, who's now the only candidate to become the interim premier and then to oversee extraordinary new elections reflecting a new political reality. Hence, it's the new political reality that justifies the optimism.
Philip and Levon, I can see you both share that optimism. Philip, go ahead. On what grounds?
Armenia always had a pretty strong potential. It's a very well-educated country, especially the young people who have been leading the movement. They didn't have the interest or the opportunity to participate in governance, but they are clearly making a step forward. And even within the lower ranks of the current government, there are a lot of young, bright people ready and willing to continue who weren't necessarily associated with the regime. So there doesn't need to be any kind of a major change of overhaul of everybody. The top leadership needs to change. And from there on, there can be a lot of continuity in a positive sense and change of the institutions that were corrupt and, frankly, colonial. So there is, I see, a big wave of decolonization happening in an institutional sense, specifically because the generation leading the charge right now is a post-Soviet generation.
Okay. Levon, let me ask you, I mean, at risk potentially right now through this change in government is Armenia's relationship with Russia. It's one that is very strong. You can call it, as some have insinuated, somewhat colonial. But it is at present Armenia's strongest ally and partner. Is Armenia prepared to risk that relationship, or in your opinion, is it a good thing to put that relationship in a different space?
I think you should, I was very encouraged by Pashinyan's remarks during the press conference he held with foreign reporters, specifically mentioning that he is not going to make any sudden geopolitical moves, that this movement is really a pan-Armenian movement, an interior movement that doesn't challenge the geopolitical order in the region. And I think he has been on the record opposing some of the pro-Russian policies of the previous government, but he has also come out and said that he is willing to be quite pragmatic, that these agreements, the defense agreement, the economic agreement is already there, and he is going to work to make them work for Armenia better than the previous government had. So I think those are very encouraging signs for me, showing that he's not just a revolutionary, that he can be quite pragmatic, that, you know, with all the populism he has been channeling through, there is a pragmatist streak in him, and he is not going to rock the boat, at least for now. And I think the reaction of Russian authorities so far, the fact that you didn't even hear the term color revolution applied to Armenia, speaks to the fact that they are not worried about some kind of a sudden Ukraine-like geopolitical shift in Armenia. And I think they've been quite wise, because there is really not a lot of anti-Russian sentiment in Armenia. There is some resentment about the country's dependence on Russia for everything from defense to economy. But I think a lot of people realize that for now, and for the foreseeable future, it's a geopolitical necessity. Having Russia and Russian military bases is not going to change in the next at least 5 to 10 years.
Okay, so Richard, Armenia is not Ukraine. Pashinyan is not the Saakashvili of Georgia. And this revolution or uprising will not be the Tahrir Square we saw in Egypt that arguably produced results that most of the participants in the Tahrir Square uprising were rather unhappy with. Armenia is different.
Well, yes, clearly. What we also see is much of the protests were overwhelmingly domestic in nature. Therefore, the continued reforms and changes to come will also similarly be domestic in nature. And to be honest, Armenia is too small to fail, meaning that it doesn't really take many and it doesn't take much for real sustainable development and change.
Okay, Philip, just on to our last minutes. I'll give you some final thoughts.
I fully support what I heard. I think Russia also behaved very well, and perhaps a lesson learned from Ukraine, because apart from all the gains that Russia registered, it also lost the entire Ukraine and Georgia. And I think these are the lessons learned, and Russia didn't want to lose Armenia. I see actually a lot of positive coming in the future, because this is now a legitimate new government, hopefully soon, taking charge in Armenia, and it can be a new beginning for relationships with Russia on a more equal footing, but also with Turkey, with Azerbaijan, and with the rest of the neighborhood as well. So I'm quite optimistic looking forward.
Okay. I must say I'm so glad to see the sense of optimism between the three of you there. We're going to have to leave it for now, but I'd like to thank you so much for joining us all on this edition of The Newsmakers. Still to come, the battle to keep the internet free. Could the days of net neutrality be coming to an end? And the deadliest day for journalists in Afghanistan. We speak to a reporter there who believes he can make a difference. Can you imagine a world without YouTube, Netflix, or Facebook? Well, that might have been the case if we didn't have something called net neutrality. It's basically a principle that ensures all data online is treated equally. But that could be coming to an end. Last year, under new management, the U.S. Federal Communications Commission voted to repeal neutrality legislation, and critics have been outraged. They say that not only is it threatening freedom of speech, but it could create a digital divide between rich and poor. On the other hand, the FCC says ending heavy-handed regulation will promote competition and create jobs. So who's right? For more, here's Christine Provolakis.
The days of America's free and open internet seem numbered. Now that U.S. regulators are about to roll back the rules that maintain net neutrality.
means an end to a free and open internet. That means now you might have to pay for things like Twitter and Instagram, and folks will start carving up the internet into packages. And people with more means will have access to more spaces and places on the interweb.
The Federal Communications Commission voted to scrap net neutrality rules late last year, a regulation initially adopted in 2015. Without net neutrality, internet service providers like Verizon, Comcast, and AT&T could influence consumers on what they see and how quickly they see it. They can block, slow down, or favor one website or service over another. The FCC says the old rules hindered innovation and prevented investment in expanding broadband networks.
The legend of a cable company trying to break the internet may make a scary bedtime story for children of telecom geeks, but it isn't reality.
Net neutrality says internet service providers need to treat all content, applications, and web services equally, and that determines how online traffic works. When a person gets on the internet superhighway, they can head to a variety of destinations. They can shop at a mall, look at a messaging app, or seek answers to a medical question. And no matter where they want to go, they can access destinations at the same speed. But if net neutrality is taken away, internet service providers could choose to speed up or slow down access to certain content, prioritizing how quickly you can get from A to B. They can now also start charging money for better access to content. Net neutrality supporters say this would not only hurt internet users, but also small companies and startups, which can't afford such fees. The issue has led to months of protests.
We need to have an open and free internet, not one in which the content, the speed, the access is controlled by corporate interests, which typically are not in the interest of the common people.
The repeal of net neutrality rules won't go into effect until the White House approves it. But that could be blocked next week after Democratic senators try to force a vote to undo the repeal.
The speculation is that consumer interests will be harmed if the broadband carriers are permitted to interfere with consumer access to the network.
Tech companies like Mozilla, Vimeo, and Foursquare have filed lawsuits to preserve net neutrality. And around 20 U.S. states, including Washington, Alaska, and California, are opposing the FCC by passing their own net neutrality state laws. Civil rights organizations in the UN say repealing the 2015 rules could affect the right to free speech, not only in the U.S., but also in the rest of the world.
If the American system somehow restricts the ability of information to get out in the U.S., that will obviously also have an impact on the availability of information to the rest of the world about information in the U.S., perhaps about academic and scientific information, health information.
Internet providers argue consumers who don't like their service can always switch providers, but it's not as easy as that. Based on their location, many people only have access to adequate broadband from one internet provider, and that means a lot of control is in the hands of just one company. So should net neutrality be protected or scrapped altogether? Christine Pirovolakis, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Denver is Chris Hansen. He's a state legislator in Colorado's House of Representatives. And from Washington, D.C., we have Brent Skorup. He is a senior research fellow in the Technology Policy Program at George Mason University, and he serves on the FCC's Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee. Now, we invited the FCC to join us on the program. Unfortunately, they declined our invitation. Well, let's get straight to it. Let me start with Brent. If the argument goes, internet service providers can make a fortune, like telecoms, for example, charging customers monthly subscription fees or usage fees, why not protect net neutrality? Why put the web at the potential mercy of corporate interests?
Thank you, thank you for having me. So net neutrality, I mean, it's come to mean a lot of different terms. In 2015, the Obama administration urged the FCC, the communications and media regulator, to regulate internet service providers. The order doesn't get at that competitive issue that you mentioned, this idea of them raising rates. That's a competitive issue, and the FCC in the order says competition is not really what the rules are getting at. We have competition agencies, we have the Federal Trade Commission, we have the DOJ, and those are the proper agencies to police pricing and the abuse of market power. And that existed before the 2015 rules, that existed after 2015 rules, and with the repeal of the 2015 rules, that goes back, the authority to police competition goes back to the Federal Trade Commission.
Okay, Chris Hansen, does that sound fair?
Well, I think there's a serious problem that is not being addressed. And the way we've tried to approach it in Colorado is that we want to protect Colorado taxpayers from possible abuse from internet providers. And so it's fine to say that we want lots of competition, but the problem is in rural areas of the U.S., there's typically only one provider. And in Colorado, like many other states, we use state resources to make sure that the rural areas have service. And if those providers are now able to charge for fast lanes, those consumers are not going to have any choice and no protection left because of the change of the FCC. So I think in rural areas of the U.S. where there's only one provider, there's a big problem that's going to be brewing here.
I mean, Brett, then how do you mitigate that? For areas where there only is one provider, competition doesn't matter. They're at the mercy of that one system.
Yeah, that's an important issue, rural coverage and the number of providers in rural areas. That's not a net neutrality issue. And the 2015 order is clear that the rules are not about competitive threats. So the U.S. in the past 20 years has spent about $100 billion on rural telecommunications and broadband services. It might not be spent ideally, but there is investment, and that's the purpose of universal service funds. That's not a net neutrality issue, but that's an important issue. Net neutrality comes with all this baggage in the U.S. because what the FCC did in 2015 was they had to use a regulatory hook, and what they said is internet service looks like telephone and telegraph, and we can use our telephone and telegraph regulations, what's called Title II of the Communications Act of 1934. We're going to use this Title II regulations on the internet, and that's not a good policy. That's not the policy we had when the U.S. became a leader in telecommunications and internet technology. And it's also, it violates federal policy. So in 1996, the Republican Congress, Democrat Bill Clinton, passed a law saying that it's the policy of the United States that the internet, and specifically internet access, should be unfettered from federal and state regulation. And in 2015, for political reasons, the FCC decided to regulate the internet, and it violates the policy of the United States, the successful policy of the United States, to leave the internet to the marketplace and to competition agencies.
Chris, there is a problem here in that, even as I'm listening to some of these explanations, when you get down to the details in these laws, it just gets confusing. You run the risk of consumers giving up and feeling like, okay, you know what, this is just like watching television or listening to the radio. There are going to be some advertisers in there that maybe I don't want to hear, but they're going to be part of this, and I am kind of comfortable with what, consumers just have to get used to. Is that what might happen here because these laws are so confusing?
Well, yeah, and I think it's not just, am I seeing advertising I don't like? I think the threat is a little bit more serious than that. And so again, going back to, you're in a small town, and in this case, rural Colorado, up in the mountains, you've got one provider who has been brought to your home with universal service funds, so taxpayer money. And that provider perhaps bids out that service at a very low rate, but then tries to make up the difference by charging you extra to see certain content, or throttling, or creating paid fast lanes. And now that the net neutrality protections are gone, that consumer really has no choice and no protection from that type of service. And so I don't think it's just advertising. It could be a situation where, a piece of content that they want is going to be slowed down or blocked, or they're going to have to pay extra to get it. And I think if you play that scenario out over lots of different companies, lots of different content, you have a very dangerous situation for the American taxpayer. And I think that's what we were trying to do in Colorado, is prevent that scenario. So anytime taxpayer money is being used to provide service, we want to make sure it's net neutral service and that there isn't that extra paid fast lane or throttling problem that could occur now that we've had this change at the FCC.
Okay, Brent, I'm going to go back to my initial question with you, because I just want you to, if you can, give me a simple answer. Why aren't subscription and monthly usage fees enough for these internet service providers? As I said, telecom's made a fortune off of that. Why can't we just leave it with monthly usage and subscription fees?
So you see this in many businesses, not just the internet, where it's called a double-sided market, where you have multiple inputs. And so advertising is another example, in TV marketplace. Cable operators make money off subscriptions. They also make it off advertising. And so there are different business models for this. And with the internet, what you're seeing is that large, particularly video companies like Netflix and YouTube and Facebook, they require a lot of infrastructure to serve consumers. And so these companies have paid a lot of money to build their own private internets to consumer broadband lines. And there are disputes, there will be disputes about how to allocate that fairly. And that's a commercial dispute, and there are certainly important competition problems. But to me, that's not a net neutrality problem. That's not what the 2015 rules are intended to handle.
Okay. I mean, Chris, the argument for critics that believe in net neutrality say, the difference with the internet is that it's such tailored information and such personal communication. Is that what you feel as well? I mean, that any time you get big business interested in making this a market similar to what Brent was saying with cable providers, you risk all sorts of issues of free speech and everything else that come with that.
Yeah, Andrea, I think that's exactly right, and I think that's what we were so concerned about in Colorado. And as you mentioned in the lead up to our time together, this is across many states in the U.S. are worried about this exact same problem. Free speech, access to new commercial business models, making sure that people can express themselves and receive the information that they want. All of those things could be under threat here, and I think that's why people across the country have reacted so strongly and why we decided to bring the legislation forward in Colorado to address that problem. I mean, this gets to the fundamental bedrocks of a free and open society, and the ability to talk to your friends, to express your ideas, to be successful in a commercial way with, you mentioned startups and new innovative companies. All of those things could be threatened if we make major changes in the way that content is transmitted across the internet. And so I think, with the FCC protections now removed, it's incumbent on the states to act. And that's really, I think, the crux of what we were trying to do here in Colorado.
Okay, and Brent, I mean, we heard in that report that the UN believes, the United Nations believes, there could be global implications for what the United States does in this space and how it tries to change general net neutrality. And another problem here is that, people have compared this to corporate interests versus the same lines as government censorship, government interference in internet content. Do you see any validity in that? Because this is what the globe actually fears happening. Instead of governments interfering, it will be corporate interests interfering in what we can access on the World Wide Web.
Yeah, I'd like to emphasize there are large corporate interests on both sides of this debate. I mean, you tend to have internet service providers on one side, and you have large tech companies like Google, Facebook, and Netflix on the other. So there's corporate interests on both sides. The concern I have is that by regulating internet using its Title II regulation, that's the strictest regulatory regime the FCC has as disposal. And so that's bringing the internet closer to the government. And in the past, the FCC has not been friendly to consumers and to competition. And I don't think that's a good message to send anywhere. And it violates U.S. policy, which is that the internet should be free of regulation. I'd also like to make a subtle but important point, which is with all this baggage that comes with Title II, a perverse incentive came out of the 2015 rules. So in the 2015 rules, the FCC said essentially, if you look like a telephone company, we're going to regulate you like a telephone company. And this is conventional broadband. They said, it looks like telephone, we're going to regulate it like telephone. In litigation, it came out that the judge asked the FCC lawyer, the Obama FCC lawyer, what if an internet service provider blocks content? And this is kind of the fear of net neutrality proponents. What if they block content? And the Obama FCC lawyer said, if they filter content they don't wish to distribute, they drop out of the rules. They're less regulated if they filter content than if they offer conventional broadband. This is a very perverse incentive to internet service providers because they're less regulated if they filter content. And this is something that the Trump FCC noted when it repealed the rules, was that this is not a good incentive for ISPs, that they're less regulated when they block content.
Okay, Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the average citizen is not worried about Title II. They're worried about getting the content that they would like to access and not having the threat of being throttled or having to pay extra for it. So, I think this is an important policy debate at the federal level and whether it should be in Title I, Title II, et cetera. But I think we're talking about a much more of a kitchen table type issue here, and one that gets to the heart of who we are as Americans. So, I would agree we want to have less regulation here where we can possibly reduce regulation, but we have a new problem that's been created by changing the FCC oversight, and that is that we now open up business models that could be very abusive to American consumers. And I think we've got to get serious about addressing that problem, because as this plays out, you could have some very serious repercussions for the average American. And as you mentioned, Andrea, this could ripple across the world. So it's a complicated issue, no doubt. The internet is worldwide. It's not like one state or one jurisdiction can change the entire setup. But I think we have to take this threat very seriously and be proactive about it. And that was really my worry with the change at the FCC level late last year.
Brent, let me just put this to you before we go. The Federal Trade Commission's acting chairman, another Trump appointee like Ajit Pai, the current chief of the FCC, said she believes there's a lack of confidence in market forces and that antitrust laws are really enough to protect consumers. Do you believe that's true?
So I agree with Chris. The competition problems are real, but they won't be fixed. I disagree in that the FCC can fix them. The FCC, we must remember, a lot of the competition problems are because for decades, the U.S. government, state governments, and the FCC allowed one phone provider in every locality and one cable provider in every locality. So this was government regulation that gave us only a handful of providers. And so I don't think the remedy can be, we need government regulation to fix this competition problem. I think the competition laws are adequate. We certainly don't have the ideal situation, but there's been a lot of investment in these companies. And mobile, in fact, is becoming increasingly a substitute for landline broadband service. So these things are getting better. And I'll add, this to me is the real tragedy of the net neutrality debate, because we have this very partisan fight at this point when about these very complicated issues about the baggage of Title II regulation, when the FCC could have spent the past decade looking at investment. How do we get USF, Universal Service Funds, into rural areas? How do we get broadband deployment into rural and underserved areas? But this net neutrality fight has distracted the FCC. It's become a top priority. And which is why I'm encouraged that last year, Ajit Pai, Chairman Pai, created the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee, of which I'm a part, to look at these issues. What are cities doing that might inhibit broadband deployment? What are competitors doing that might inhibit broadband deployment? And to me, that's where the focus should be, not on net neutrality.
Chris, quick final words, because I can see you have something to say.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Andrea. So I just wanted to mention, it was brought up that this was a partisan fight, and I actually don't see it that way at all. 83% of Americans in the latest polls that I've seen want to see net neutrality protections. This is wide, broad consensus that we need to make sure consumers are protected. 83% of Americans want this. It's not breaking down on partisan lines. The vast majority of Democrats, Republicans, and independents want to make sure that consumers are protected. And so I think we need to stay true to those desires and protect the American public.
Okay, and we will have to leave it there. I'd like to thank both of our guests so much for joining us on this segment of The Newsmakers. In Afghanistan, fatal attacks, often carried out by Daesh or Taliban-controlled suicide bombers, are sadly all too common. The security situation has been deteriorating badly in recent years, and journalists in the country are finding themselves ever more at risk. Bilal Sarwari is one of those journalists. He's covered the region for years, and he's now running to become a member of the Afghan parliament for Kunar province. He joins me now from Kabul. Hi, Bilal. Thanks so much for joining us. I mean, I feel like a broken record with you. I've lost count of how many times I've had to ask you the details of these monstrous attacks. The element, I guess, that's different this time, though, is that it seems journalists were the clear target. It is difficult enough to cover Afghanistan. And is there a risk now that the much-needed coverage of what's happening in the country will even become too dangerous for the boldest among us?
I think what you see is unprecedented level of brutality. I think you see little or no disregard for civilians, including members of the media, my own colleagues. But at the same time, there are a lot of questions that one could ask. How is it that this area in the heart of Kabul that houses the most sensitive and strategic installations of the Afghan intelligence service gets attacked time and again? Whose fault is it? What sort of competent leadership or incompetent leadership is the cause of these tragedies? I think you're clearly seeing aerial surveillance in the area, sniffer dogs, increasing level of security, and yet again we see an attack where the first attacker detonated his explosives, passing, we believe, we're being told there were scanners, sophisticated scanners, put in place with the help of Western and possibly American intelligence agencies like the CIA. So one has to ask a lot of questions. Then it's the issue of reporters doing their job, being the eyes and ears of the people of Afghanistan to the world. They were 300 meters or so away from the site of the area. A number of them were there with cameras and microphones, so quite visible. We heard from the group Daesh saying that they targeted the apostate media, as they call it. But unfortunately, what we see is journalism has many enemies in this country.
Right. And I mean, what does that ultimately mean for Afghanistan when so much fear and intimidation stops journalists from doing the work?
I think Afghans lost a lot of their voices yesterday. These were simply not numbers. These are lives. Families lost their breadwinners, daughters and sons are orphaned, and this is this agony and pain that continues for generations. I think what you see with someone like Shamurai or many of my other colleagues, they were really the eyes of Afghanistan to the world. Someone who started in 2001 or even before that as a driver and worked up his way to be the chief photographer, I think shows you that he was carrying the hopes, aspirations, fears, and concerns of this post-9/11 generation. He wasn't the blue blood. He really earned the respect of his colleagues across the aisle. He had a chance to work outside of Afghanistan. Yet again, he chose to be here.
Okay.
Unfortunately, what we see is this continuous failure in terms of the Afghan government failing to protect its people.
His voice, I mean, what you're saying there, though, first and foremost, is that these voices are being silenced, much to the detriment of the Afghan public that will no longer have strong reporters to expose what's going on, particularly in government. And now it's government that you're looking to enter. And interestingly enough, Bilal, the top of the program, we spoke about Nikol Pashinyan in Armenia, who is also a former journalist, former editor of an opposition newspaper, who is now a major player in Armenia's political landscape. The problem is, there is a question about your compromising your integrity when you enter politics. When you criticize the government so staunchly, as you always have, your viewers now have to wonder if it's actually part of a personal agenda to get you the votes that you want to become a member of parliament. What do you say to that?
I think that's a fair criticism. I think it's a fair concern. But here in Afghanistan, I have stayed in this country like many other young Afghans. I went and studied in the US, and this time I want to step up to the plate and serve my people. I think it's time that we pay our dues back. I mean, for me, it's a very personal decision, because what I've seen as an Afghan is that I've contributed to Afghan journalism. I've traveled across the country. I don't think I can really hide my passion and love for this country and people. At the end of the day, I'm an Afghan. And now I want to really see, hopefully, my other young men and women of my generation who will hopefully complete a generational transition of politics and power. I think the intention is not to get rich. The intention is not to get a name. At least on my part, that's my clear intention. My family, my friends really know that. And let's really see. Let's really see how we do with ballots, how we are received by the people. I believe I've traveled Afghanistan over the last 17 years. I've studied in the US. I've traveled the world. I believe I'm in a better position to serve my people. Now, what I do as a member of parliament, I think, is a good question. I think that's for time to tell. I think there will be a lot of transparency. And I think what you will see is a lot of new faces. I think you will see a generational transition, hopefully, because we can't just simply sit here and complain and say, this doesn't work and that doesn't work.
But what about the issue, I'll go back to it, of the public questioning your agenda as what is supposed to be an objective journalist? When you want to run for public office and you use the media as, in a sense, a campaign platform for yourself at no cost for yourself, I mean, you're actually getting paid to do this work while campaigning. What do you do when the public begins to criticize that?
I think the public can know that as a journalist, I continue to tell what is the truth and only the truth. I have not really campaigned. I went back to my home village. I stood before 500 people or so, and I told them, if you back me, I am at your service. I want to serve you.
But you don't see a conflict of interest in your work?
I've got no... I don't, not now. I think once campaigning starts, that's when I will come out quite transparently. I've got no fear of being outspoken. I've got no fear of being transparent with what I do. Otherwise, I would have not allowed for the pictures to be taken. And many Afghans and many other people across the world actually just came out and said that will be a good choice. Now, I have not actively started campaigning. This is called consulting with your tribes and sub-tribes. It's a very traditional system, which is quite effective. So it was initially a jirga, and let's see that. Okay. I really don't see that. What I say on TV and what I tell the world is what I really see it as to be the truth.
Okay, and Bilal, you will let your voters decide. I'd like to thank you so much for joining us on this edition of The Newsmakers. Bilal Sarwari. That's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. Remember, you can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, a group of men dubbed the Wolf Pack is cleared of rape charges in Spain. Mass protests have called for a change in the law. Until then, thanks for watching. Goodbye.